Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another fascinating topic. Today, we're heading to 19th century Brazil with a novel that really shook things up. Escrava Isaura.
The slave Azora in English.
Exactly. Now, this isn't just some forgotten story. It actually sparks a huge national conversation about slavery in Brazil.
It really did. And you know what's fascinating to me? This book, it came out in 1875, right when the abolition movement was gaining real momentum. It was like holding up a mirror to Brazilian society.
Forcing people to confront the reality of slavery, which they've been trying to ignore for so long.
Exactly.
Now, to help us unpack all this, we've got excerpts from the book itself, plus some critical analyses and historical context to really give us the full picture.
Sounds like we're in for a treat.
So let's transport ourselves back to Brazil, during the reign of Emperor Pedro II. Picture a wealthy plantation.
Okay, I'm there.
And at the heart of it is our main character, Isaura. She's not your typical enslaved woman.
What makes her different?
Well, for one, she's described as beautiful, light-skinned, and incredibly talented, thanks to the education she received from the plantation owner's wife.
That's still trapped in slavery.
Exactly. The novel actually compares her to a garça real, a royal heron.
Oh, I see. Standing out among the common birds.
A perfect metaphor for her situation. Elevated by her spirit and talents, but held back by her legal status.
A stark contrast indeed.
Then there's Leôncio, Isaura's enslaver. He becomes absolutely fixated on her.
He's the one who,
Yeah, he's the one who owns the plantation,
Yeah.
the wealthy landowner.
Got it.
And he's kind of a complex character. Educated in Europe with a bit of a, sophisticated air about him, but ultimately driven by his desires and a sense of entitlement.
It's that European education that gets me. It highlights this hypocrisy, right? Embracing these Enlightenment ideas back in Europe, but then perpetuating barbarity in their colonies.
Yeah, total disconnect.
Leoncio really embodies that moral corruption that slavery breeds.
Blinded by his lust for Isaura, and willing to manipulate anyone to get what he wants.
Even his own wife.
Exactly, Malvina. She initially seems kind towards Isaura, but she gets caught in Leoncio's web of lies.
Influenced by Rosa, too. Don't forget her.
Right, Rosa, another enslaved woman who's insanely jealous of Isaura.
It's tragic how that poisonous power dynamic infects every single relationship. Even well-intentioned people can become complicit in a system like slavery.
Absolutely. Now, amidst all this turmoil, there's Miguel, Isaura's father.
He's the one who desperately wants to buy her freedom.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's a hardworking, loving father, representing that unwavering hope for a better future. But his efforts are constantly sabotaged by Leoncio's greed.
It's heartbreaking.
And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Isaura and Miguel, they make a daring escape to Recife.
Risking everything for freedom.
It's a real testament to their courage and resilience.
But their escape also exposes the hypocrisy of that society, claiming to be civilized while upholding such a brutal system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, while in Recife, Isaura, she goes by the name Elvira, and she meets Alvaro, a wealthy and idealistic student who falls head over heels for her.
But he has no idea she's a fugitive.
No clue.
Alvaro represents that potential for change, though, that moral awakening that's needed.
He challenges social norms and exposes those deep-seated prejudices.
Even among those who weren't directly involved in slavery.
But their happiness is short-lived. Leoncio tracks Isaura down, armed with a precatoria, basically a legal document used to control enslaved people.
This confrontation between Alvaro and Leoncio is so pivotal.
It really is.
You have these clashing moral codes playing out, Leoncio clinging to the letter of the law.
While Alvaro appeals to a higher sense of justice and humanity.
Two completely different worldviews.
And Leoncio's cruelty reaches a whole new level when he drags Isaura back to the plantation. He confines her to a quarto escuro do tronco. It translates to a dark room with shackles.
That's a chilling image.
As a final act of degradation, Leoncio decides to force Isaura to marry Belchior, the plantation's gardener.
He was described as disfigured and simple, right?
Yes, this isn't just cruelty, it's calculated. Leoncio's trying to break her spirit, punish her for rejecting him, and exert his absolute dominance.
Using marriage as a weapon.
Twisting it into a means of control.
It shows how deeply corrupted even the institution of marriage was under slavery.
But just when all hope seems lost, Alvaro swoops in. He arrives at the plantation just in time to prevent the marriage, and he exposes Leoncio's financial ruin.
Talk about a hero's entrance.
And it's poetic justice, too, because Alvaro, by buying Leoncio's debts, he gains the power to free Isaura.
within the confines of that legal system.
And this is where Malvina finally sees her husband for the monster he truly is.
A bit late, but better late than never, I suppose.
The novel doesn't shy away from the consequences of Leôncio's actions either.
What happens to him?
It hints at a rather grim end, suggesting that his cruelty ultimately leads to his downfall.
A reminder that actions have consequences. Even in a system as corrupt as slavery, there's a sense of moral reckoning.
You know what's really striking to me? Even though the story is about these intensely personal struggles, it also taps into something larger, almost mythical.
Right, like when Isaura is compared to the Mandola Rosa, the Virgin Mary and her sorrow.
Exactly. That's just one example of how the novel uses symbolism to elevate Isaura's struggle beyond the personal.
She's often compared to a saint, even a Christ-like figure.
It connects her suffering to a larger spiritual narrative.
Right. Suggesting that her fight for freedom is part of this greater battle between good and evil.
And speaking of good versus evil, how did Brazilians back then react to this novel? It seems pretty radical for its time.
Oh, it definitely caused a stir. Some people praised it for its realism and its stance against slavery.
Especially those who were pushing for abolition.
Exactly. They must have felt seen and empowered by Isaura's story.
But there were others who condemned the novel. They thought it was too sympathetic to the enslaved and threatened the social order.
They probably saw it as dangerous propaganda.
It definitely sparked some intense debates,
Mm-hmm.
especially with abolition still a few years away. A Escrava Isaura. It wasn't just a book, it was a cultural phenomenon. It challenged people's views on race, class, and power, and forced them to confront the ugly truth about their own society.
Powerful.
And its reach went far beyond Brazil's borders. It became an international sensation, translated into multiple languages, adapted for stage and screen, and even made into a telenovela.
A telenovela. Wow, I can already picture the drama, the close-ups, the passion.
They're not far off. Telenovelas are those soap operas, super popular in Latin America. And Escrava Isaura was a huge hit, but its influence went beyond just entertainment. It actually shaped international perceptions of slavery, gave fuel to the abolitionist movement worldwide.
So it wasn't just a story, it was a catalyst for social change on a global scale.
Exactly. And that's what makes this novel so enduring. The story might be set in the 19th century, but those themes of social justice, human dignity, the struggle for equality, they still resonate with us today.
They do. It's like you said earlier, those power dynamics, that dehumanization, it's still present in different forms.
It hasn't gone away.
Sadly, no. We might not have chattel slavery in the same way, but we see those same patterns of exploitation and oppression in things like modern-day slavery, human trafficking, systemic racism.
It makes you wonder what Guimarães would think if he could see the world today. Would he be encouraged by the progress or disheartened by how much work still needs to be done?
That's a tough question to answer. It's one that each reader has to wrestle with on their own. I think the key takeaway from A Escrava Isaura is that it gives us this lens to examine these complexities, both in history and in the present.
So it's not just about condemning the past,
Yeah,
but understanding how it shapes the challenges we face today.
exactly. It's about recognizing that the fight for human dignity and justice, it's a continuous journey, one that requires our attention, our empathy, and most importantly, action.
I think that's a powerful message for our listeners. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what surprised you most about Escrava Isaura?
What really struck me were the characters. How nuanced they were, even Leôncio. Despite his cruelty, he's not just this one-dimensional villain. The novel hints at his inner turmoil, the contradictions that shaped him.
It's like showing how the system itself can warp people, even those who might have had some humanity inside.
Exactly. By giving us glimpses of Leôncio's inner life, the novel challenges us to consider the root causes of such cruelty, to examine those societal structures and ideologies that allow such monstrous behavior to flourish.
It's a reminder that dismantling injustice, it's not just about punishing individuals, but about transforming systems and challenging those deep-rooted ways of thinking.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us back to the question of relevance. How does Escrava Isaura speak to us today, in a world where slavery has been formally abolished, at least in most places?
It's a great question. What are your thoughts?
Well, for me, the novel's power lies in its exploration of the human condition. It reminds us that the fight for freedom and dignity, it's a constant struggle. It transcends time and place. The specific forms of oppression may change, but those underlying dynamics, power, control, dehumanization, they persist.
So it's not just a historical document
Right.
about 19th century Brazil. It's a reflection on that universal human desire for freedom and equality.
Exactly. And it challenges us to examine our own roles in perpetuating or dismantling these systems of oppression. Are we like Alvaro actively fighting for justice? Or are we like some of the other characters, complicit in the status quo, maybe even benefiting from it without realizing it?
Those are some tough questions to consider, but they're questions we need to be asking ourselves, both individually and as a society.
I agree. A Escrava Isaura provides a framework for those conversations. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, hope and resilience can prevail, and that even small acts of courage and compassion can have a ripple effect, contributing to a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dives. A huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this exploration of A Escrava Isaura.
It's been fascinating.
Absolutely. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to spark your curiosity and challenge your perspectives. Until then, take care. It's interesting that you mentioned that about Leôncio, because one of the critiques of the novel was that it was too sympathetic to the enslavers.
Yeah, I can see that. Some critics argued that by portraying Leôncio with any kind of complexity, it romanticized slavery or downplayed its brutality. But I think Guimarães was going for something more nuanced.
So you don't think he was excusing Leôncio's actions?
No, not at all. I think he was exploring the psychology of someone who was deeply entrenched in a system of oppression.
Showing how that system can warp someone,
Yeah,
even if they had some humanity in them.
exactly. And by giving us glimpses into Leôncio's inner life, it forces us to think about the root causes of that cruelty, to look at the societal structures, the ideologies that allow for monstrous behavior.
So it's not just about punishing individuals, it's about changing those systems and challenging those ways of thinking.
Right. And that brings us back to today. How does this novel, A Escrava Isaura, speak to us now, in a world where slavery has been abolished, at least formally in most places?
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I think the novel's power is in its exploration of what it means to be human. It reminds us that the fight for freedom and dignity, it's ongoing. It's something that goes beyond a specific time or place. The forms of oppression might change, but those underlying dynamics, power control, dehumanization, those things persist.
It's not just a story about 19th century Brazil, and it's a reflection on that universal desire for freedom and equality.
Exactly. And it asks us to look at our own roles in these systems. Are we actively fighting for justice like Alvaro? Or are we complicit in the status quo like some of the other characters? Maybe even benefiting from it without knowing.
Those are some tough questions to ask ourselves.
But important ones, I think. Escrava Isaura gives us a way to start those conversations. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's hope and resilience, and that even small acts of courage and compassion can make a difference. They can contribute to a more just world.
Well said, Carmen. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. A huge thank you to our listeners for joining us as we explored A Escrava Isaura.
It's been a journey.
It has. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning. We'll be back next time with another deep dive.
No.
Until then, Tiff.
Hey.